"Which other, sir?" asked Miggs, still with her fingers in her ears and her head shaking obstinately. "Why, the tallest one yonder," said Dennis, as he stroked his chin, and added, in an undertone to himself, something about not crossing Mr. Gashford. Miss Miggs replied, still being profoundly deaf, that if Miss Haredale stood in the way at all, he might make himself quite easy on that score, as she had gathered, from what passed between Hugh and Mr. Tappertit when they were last there, that she was to be removed alone, not by them, but by somebody else, to-morrow night. Mr. Dennis opened his eyes very wide at this piece of information, whistled once, considered once, and finally slapped his head once and nodded once, as if he had got the clue to this mysterious removal, and so dismissed it. Then he imparted his design concerning Dolly to Miss Miggs, who was taken more deaf than before when he began, and so remained all through. The notable scheme was this. Mr. Dennis was immediately to seek out from among the rioters some daring young fellow, and he had one in his eye, he said, who, terrified by the threats he could hold out to him, and alarmed by the capture of so many who were no better and no worse than he, would gladly avail himself of any help to get abroad and out of harm's way with his plunder, even though his journey were encumbered by an unwilling companion. Indeed, the unwilling companion, being a beautiful girl, would probably be an additional inducement and temptation. Such a person found, he proposed to bring him there on the ensuing night, when the tall one was taken off, and Miss Miggs had purposely retired, and then that Dolly should be gagged, muffled in a cloak, and carried in any handy conveyance down to the river's side, where there were abundant means of getting her smuggled snugly off in any small craft of doubtful character, and no questions asked. With regard to the expense of this removal, he would say, at a rough calculation, that 2 or 3 silver tea or coffee pots, with something additional for drink, such as a muffineer or toast rack, would more than cover it. Articles of plate of every kind having been buried by the rioters in several lonely parts of London, and particularly, as he knew, in St. James's Square, which, though easy of access, was little frequented after dark, and had a convenient piece of water in the midst, the needful funds were close at hand, and could be had upon the shortest notice. With regard to Dolly, the gentleman would exercise his own discretion. He would be bound to do nothing but to take her away and keep her away. All other arrangements and dispositions would rest entirely with himself. If Miss Miggs had had her hearing, no doubt she would have been greatly shocked by the indelicacy of a young female's going away with a stranger by night, for her moral feelings, as we have said, were of the tenderest kind. But directly Mr. Dennis ceased to speak, she reminded him that he had only wasted breath. She then went on to say, still with her fingers in her ears, that nothing less than a severe practical lesson would save the locksmith's daughter from utter ruin, and that she felt it, as it were, a moral obligation and a sacred duty to the family to wish that some one would devise one for her reformation. Miss Miggs remarked, and very justly, as an abstract sentiment which happened to occur to her at the moment, that she dared to say the locksmith and his wife would murmur and repine, if they were ever, by forcible abduction or otherwise, to lose their child, but that we seldom knew in this world what was best for us, such being our sinful and imperfect natures, that very few arrived at that clear understanding. Having brought their conversation to this satisfactory end, they parted. Dennis to pursue his design and take another walk about his farm, Miss Miggs to launch, when he left her, into such a burst of mental anguish, which she gave them to understand was occasioned by certain tender things he had had the presumption and audacity to say, that little Dolly's heart was quite melted. Indeed, she said and did so much to soothe the outraged feelings of Miss Miggs, and looked so beautiful while doing so, that if the young maid had not had ample vent for her surpassing spite and a knowledge of the mischief that was brewing, she must have scratched her features on the spot. End of chapter 70.